The use of angles is paramount when it comes to filmmaking. Without the idea of comprehension that grounds a sense of perspective for the audience, judgment on characters, aesthetics, and the story wouldn't be enabled. Whilst the camera's relationship to other areas of film form is also important in constructing representation and meaning, such as the use of editing to piece together the cohesion of the shot-by-shot relationship, I would argue that how the camera is positioned horizontally and vertically in relation to a particular subject constructs the basis for the audience's line of identification, i.e. the connection we share to the characters, the ideology they represent, and the feeling they add to the overall look and feel of the film. The characterization of the camera can also directly tie into the themes that a film may choose to explore, such as trust and longing. All of this is examined by Karen McGuinness's idea of perspective techniques, which highlights the importance of more visual forms of storytelling, despite how wordy one's screenplay or script may be. Mr. Quentin Tarantino. I'm not alone in saying that I've spent at least the majority of lockdown watching movies, each one very different from the last, from drama adaptations to sci-fi classics. Nevertheless, despite the expansive stylistic and topical variation between these films, despite the vastly different worlds and characters these films choose to explore, there is an element pretty much universal to all of these movies: how the camera is utilised. Now, of course, how the camera is positioned and the sense of dimension it brings is not mutually exclusive between certain genres.
So what is a
or
screenplay, or what
filmmakers.
might it be?
For example, if we were to just look at the implementation of wide establishing shots and the relationship brought by the denotive and connotative meaning, speaking practically, they are used universally for introducing a new location and forwarding the narrative. If we were looking at more subjective meaning, they are used universally in highlighting a sense of scale, more often than not reflecting the weight that has been built up on the character's shoulders, personifying perhaps the emotional baggage of the journey that they are taking. Now, of course, there are many variations to the rule when it comes to the coordination of the three-act structure and Todorovian narrative style that is actually shaped by particular angles. However, one aspect of the camera which makes no exceptions is the abundance of side angles. Often crafted by the familiarity of eye-level orientation, mimicking how humans view the world as put by filmmaker Anna Kaiser, one would pretty much always find this angle on a DOP storyboard. This is interesting, as these side views often position audiences along a observational line of identification. This more passive mode of spectatorship is expanded by the likes of Laura Mulvey, who talk about the room for objectification and fetishism this opens, often tying it back to a feminist discussion. This is important as it opens the conversation as to the audience's role in consuming and interpreting the messages films put across, owed in part due to the creative decision in framing a subject more side-on than directly. If we were to look at the opposite side of the scale, we would be looking at what is called the breakage of the fourth wall, with the composition of the character looking straight at the camera, switching round the audience's involvement with the diegesis. This is used for an array of creative purposes and production-bound subjective meaning, whether tapping into the psychological torment of an individual who perhaps influenced the direction of the treatment, or signifying the alignment to more abrasive styles of cinema that encourages instead a more active mode of viewing. The discussion so far then has outlined two reasons as to why filmmakers like to implement this sort of angle: practical and theoretical use. I think the best way to look at these uses is to look at a time where one could only tell a story visually, the era of silent film. Defined most often by the documentary style of the Lumiere brothers and the fanciful creative exuberance of Georges Méliès, the camera was viewed much like a paintbrush, with the world as the filmmaker's canvas. If we examine the first movies literally ever recorded by the Lumiere brothers, not only do we see the prevalent side angle, but through it, the bustling backdrop of the city streets that these townspeople are not only framed in, but are actually living in. The way in which we as spectators are positioned just slightly out of the line of the real lives of these people brought a whole new living, breathing dimension to the prevailing style of realism of the 19th century. Not only because of the revolutionary platform of cinema that is actually presenting it, but also because of the room for judgment and interpretation that the choice of angle allows within the composition of these mid-shots. The work of Georges Méliès is a more extreme example. This is abundantly clear with the adherent stylishness of the mise-en-scène. This can be seen with the costumes and the overall spectrum of colour that we somehow manage to gauge through the more formalist style of performance and the attention to detail with the set design. This all outlines a very different creative trajectory, and along with that, the approach to how the camera is used. Whilst once again we are observing, the wide stage-like composition of the side angle positions audiences in the seats of a theatre rather than a spectator of film. This is good at demonstrating how the choice of angle helps harness the look and feel of a movie, whether realist or surrealist. The force of the side angle can, of course, still be felt in modern cinema, where variation can be seen from abstract to rhetorical forms of narrative structure that guide the spectatorship. The influence seen by this specific alignment range from staple storytelling techniques, such as shot-reverse shot between characters, to action shots, following a car chase for example. It's interesting how this idea of loss of centrality between people and place has continued to frame the conflicts and themes throughout the history of cinema. From here, one can then highlight a universal feeling of not belonging. That would make sense, considering how experts can tie even traces of prehistoric art back to the exploration of identity and the understanding of self, which, more often than not, were also presented at side angles. Does the use of angle warrant a look at meaning and further reading? Or is it just a simple case of varying up the cinematography for a more holistic experience? Is it just easier to help guide the pace of the edit? I'm not sure. I like to think there's a balance between the artistic intent of the treatment and the practicality of actually helping ground a coherent relationship between the vehicle that guides the audience through the story and the story itself. But that's my opinion. Now, before I end the video, let me ask you, are you a casual fan of film? Are you interested in what's been going on behind the scenes of some of your favourite anticipated releases? Do you like the conversation that comes with weekly film reviews? If your answers to any of these questions are yes, then I highly recommend checking out Cinemarcus on Mixcloud, or Ipswich Community Radio 105.7 FM. Bringing out weekly content every Thursday evening, Cinemarcus is a film podcast coming straight from the heart, where topics range from weekly news segments to reviews and top 10 lists. He's just got his show off the ground, and any support and feedback would be greatly appreciated. This is not a sponsor, just a friendly recommendation.